Good afternoon. We'll begin the session in about 2 more minutes. I think everybody's just wrapping lunch, so thank you for your patience. Civil society?
Every time I lost luggage, I smiling, and the airline officer do not understand. I said, have insurance, I can have new clothes.
Okay, right. I think we're about to begin. Welcome. My name is Jyoti Pandey. I work for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. This is a session on trade agreements. And before we begin the session, just a show of hands. How many people here in the room have ever been in a face-to-face trade negotiation? Okay, none. So, well, apart from our eminent panelists, who I'll get to in a minute, welcome. This is somewhat of a new topic, even for me. So we'll try to keep it as simple. Though given how complex the issue is, we'll see how the discussions go. Okay. On my, introducing my panelists now, on my left we have Duangthep Chomprang. I'll just let her introduce herself 1 second.
Thank you, Jyoti. So I was actually requested last minute to join as one of the panel speaker could not turn up. I come as a personal capacity, but I work for the International Institute for Trade and Development, which is a regional organization created by the UN General Assembly to support Asia Pacific on trade and development issues. So under this remit, it includes all trade and business laws and treaties relating to digital trade, as well as e-commerce related issues. Thank you.
Thank you. On my right, we have Mr. Vanavit Akuputra. He's fairly well known in internet governance circles, but on this panel, his expertise is incomparable because we are discussing a trade negotiation called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and Mr. Akuputra is the chair of the working group on e-commerce. On his right is Professor Pengwa. Professor Pengwa, of course, is a stalwart in IG circles. He also is closely involved with the negotiations that are taking place in Singapore, which is one of the countries that is involved in these trade negotiations. And we finally have, to his right is Rajneesh Singh, who does not need an introduction. He is the only one who's been in a face-to-face trade negotiation apart from Mr. Akuputra on this panel. So we're really looking forward to hearing his views. Without further ado, so we're going to try and keep this as a bit of a freewheeling discussion because the agenda here is to actually introduce people to how trade arena has become the new battlefront for internet user rights. The world of trade agreements is changing rapidly, and for those who may be familiar, there are general distinctions between services and goods. that are not as clear now in the digital context. So that's one of the first few things we need to bear in mind. E-commerce negotiations are taking place in multiple trade formats. We have the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that I've mentioned. The other famous trade agreements includes the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the TPP. There's the TISA, there's the NAFTA, and while the TPP and the TISA have been shelved for now, there are talks that these trade agreements that include provisions on e-commerce will be revived. A lot of the signatories to the TPP, countries like Japan and Australia, are also members that are involved in discussions in the RCEP. So there is a bit of an overlap over there. One of the first issues I think that everyone should be aware of is that when negotiators speak of e-commerce, and this comes from the WTO representative, when they speak of e-commerce, not all of them are saying the same thing. So we need to, one way of looking and understanding how e-commerce norms are being explored is to actually look at industry demands, which are fairly clear with regard to trade. So while you hear buzzwords like platform economy, the digital revolution, digital marketplace, Internet of Things, or IT production, ICT services, these buzzwords, a lot of these buzzwords are flying around. But they all boil down to specific area, which is ICT governance, which is now enroached in the trade arena space. Also, it is important to flag off that telecom regulation is different from internet non-regulation and global competition rules, which are standard provisions included in trade negotiations generally. So to understand where global companies are coming from, so in October 2016, a bunch of these companies came together and sent a letter to the USTR, which is the United States Trade Representative, and they laid down a couple of issues that they are trying to insert in as many global areas as possible, either through trade negotiations or through global standard bodies. And just to summarize some of the issues that they have been focusing on consistently over the last few years, they seek minimum regulation of the internet. So no ITU rules, no global competition rules. E-commerce rules are, of course, supported by GAFA, which is Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon. Services rules commitments, technological neutrality, no regulation of new services, cross-border computer services. They're also seeking to establish, so the TPP had a really interesting provision where it had a transparency annex, and which included a right to comment on new regulations, which we see in the tobacco area provides for a compendium of evidence that can be used in arbitration cases for national governments. So trade itself has goods that it's trying to regulate, services. Then you have investment, and you have how international disputes are settled. And while on the face it may not be apparent how these other arenas could be used to enforce norms for internet governance at the national level, they do have an intersection, and increasingly companies are realizing that and pushing for rules with respect to these specific areas that are commonly recognized in the trade agenda. Another important, so the USTR wish list published in October 2016 was fairly clear on wanting data flows to be free across borders, prohibition of location of computer facilities, or storage, managing, and processing of data locally, enabling open and online and cloud platforms to not be accountable for what people put on them, and limiting prohibitions that governments can put on these platforms and companies. Another letter came from the Internet Association, which also expanded on some of these rights that they're seeking. So protection of copyright with safe harbor provisions and exceptions, custom moratorium on e-commerce being made permanent. There is a temporary one at the World Trade Organization at the moment. Eliminating forced technology transfers, in particularly for developing countries. So prohibitions on disclosure of source code for specific products, for platforms, or even the algorithms that operate these platforms. And they also sought a representative in the USTR office. On the face of it, these look like really positive development. I mean, there is nothing wrong with cross-border flow of information, or seeking prohibition on locally mandated storage and processing of data. But as we see in these negotiations, there are various countries at different levels of development that are involved, and their agenda in negotiating these issues also varies greatly. So given that the TISA and the TPP have fallen over, there is a push also at the WTO on e-commerce related issues. RCEP discussions are largely, so now given, I hope now it's a little bit clear why we're talking about trade, because trade is the new frontier of internet governance. But even within the trade arena, a lot of developments have taken place over the last year. The TISA and the TPP, which were two large mega regional trade agreements, have fallen over. So RCEP at the moment is the largest mega regional trade agreement that is being discussed. The RCEP is not TPPA, and the countries involved are unique with their own unique points. So for example, we have China. The narrative that China is pushing for is that it's committed to creating digital free trade zones, both within China and in the region. So you hear of initiatives like the One Belt, One Road. China has the agenda to push Alibaba in competition with GAFA. So there's that perspective to bear in mind when looking at China's role in these negotiations. We also have countries like Malaysia. So Alibaba has already established a digital free zone, and other countries like Singapore have an issue with that. So there's an interesting dynamic that is playing out between countries also involved that are competing with each other for data and flow of information. India has its own, actually just one more thing on China. China has also about getting products and services into China and establishing an ecosystem for the digital environment for countries. So whether it's digital databases, financial and logistic regimes, they are seeking to create stable economic and political systems via digital trade. India has its own strategy in these negotiations. As we all know, it's invested heavily in its ICT services, and it's focused primarily on transferring personnel and services, since the US has cut off some of these agreements that the countries had. So a lot of the personnel are trained and they don't have enough jobs. So India's pushing for the services aspect. And that kind of interfaces with what these large companies like Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon want, which is not to have data localization. So India, for example, would probably be coming from a perspective of trade facilitation on service agreement, free flow of data, no local presence if you're providing services from across the border. In RCEP, we also have a mixture of interests. We have TPP parties that have signed on but are off the hook at the moment. Some want to push for small and medium enterprises, but it is not clear if the frameworks that are being pushed through trade agenda will actually benefit small and medium enterprises. And that, of course, impacts your local innovation and your local companies. So that's also something to bear in mind. Overall, we have 4 main concerns regarding e-commerce and inclusion of e-commerce provisions in trade agreements. The first is that rules that prohibit national regulation of rules that prohibit national regulation, frameworks, and platforms. The second concern is privacy and consumer protection and how that is being protected through these agreements. Another issue that is not really been delved into too much is how strong state security powers are used to override agreements that might exist nationally or even between countries. And finally, we have the e-commerce specific chapters that weigh in on really particular issues, whether it is transfer of data, whether it's locating computing facilities within the territory of a country, or whether it's about source code disclosure or encryption standards. So those are some of the sub-issues within the larger framework that we are exploring. It is also not clear at the moment. So one thing that I would like to point out is that the TPP had leaks or documents that were made publicly available. The RCEP, however, there have been very few leaks, and we do not know currently what is being negotiated in the e-commerce chapter. So a lot of this is guesswork at which we are developing based on how discussions have evolved in other trade agreements. It is not clear, for example, if e-commerce will exclude government data or financial services or grants or even government procurement, and how the exceptions will play out in these negotiations at the moment. So very quickly, I want to highlight, and before I open the panel for discussion, I just want to lay down a framework of some of the crucial areas that impact user rights that we think are being included in the e-commerce chapter in RCEP. The first is no custom duties on digital products, and I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of each of these provisions that I list out. So when we talk about custom duties on digital products, of course it will promote digitization and it will assist in reduction of the digital divide. It will also support digital-only products and the concept that and for digital products, the concept of borders actually doesn't make sense, and this is a fairly common observation. But there's a negative side to it, where it will reduce tax revenue for sovereigns. It's not technologically neutral, and it will favor rich and established companies from the West that are the main producers of these products. The second issue, which might be included in e-commerce chapter, would be something called the prohibition of spam. On the face of it, spam is a consumer protection issue. Apart from annoyance, spam is often used for crimes such as phishing, and rules on spam in trade agreements will promote interoperable solutions. But this is already a problem that technologists have largely solved by themselves. It could force countries into adopting technologically specific dated solutions, and badly written anti-spam laws could also be misused for censorship. The third issue, which is of huge interest, given how algorithmic accountability is a topic that has been raised in several panels, is no forced disclosure of software source code. While this will prevent countries from facilitating trade secret misappropriation, and IT companies may reduce investment if they could lose their source code, this tactic is used to gain an unfair advantage by illegally repatriating foreign secrets. There are issues with source code. For example, it will inhibit countries from responding to cybersecurity emergencies like botnets. It could result in more poor quality software that has backdoors or bugs. There are other more targeted ways to address trade secret misappropriation that are already in place and are being looked at in different forums. Developing countries become a knowledge point. So for example, China really wants to develop its artificial intelligence ecosystem, and most of the components are really expensive to import. Having source code access would allow them to build these systems, but if they sign on to agreements that prohibit source code disclosure, the AI ecosystem overall could suffer. Coming to the next issue, it's a fairly important one, which is that service providers locate data locally. From the perspective of countries, this will prevent inefficient duplication of infrastructure investment. eliminates a locus for local censorship or interception of data flows, and would be prohibitive for small and medium enterprises and startups. It will, of course, also lead to loss in tax revenue. Platforms centralize their operations in tax havens. So Singapore, for example, is developing where a lot of data localization has led to investment in the country. It makes it also difficult to enforce local laws against foreign platforms. So not having data localization means governments can't seek cooperation from these platforms, and that is something that they're using to push for data localization in these agreements. There are legitimate reasons such as data protection to require local hosting, but it's a really, the entire debate on data localization is fairly recent, and lots more research is needed before we can actually decide whether storing data locally benefits users, or it actually propels censorship, or will it benefit the local economy. And there are great arguments in favor and against both of those. The next issue is the cooperation in cybersecurity and legal immunity of internet service providers. So safe harbor provisions are subject to capture by powerful copyright lobbies who are pushing for restrictive measures such as notice and stay down. Or conversely, intermediaries take advantage of safe harbor rules to profit off users by breaking the law. And this topic requires a more inclusive stakeholder consultation than possible within a trade negotiation context. From the country's perspective, harmonization of safe harbor rules will of course promote global freedom of expression. Predictable safe harbor rules facilitate global trade, and cybersecurity is part of the enabling environment for trade that governments seek to provide. And finally, the most important, apart from data localization, of course, is privacy protection, including transfer of data. Trade agreements are not negotiated by personal data protection experts. So by allowing privacy rules to control data flows only to the least trade restrictive extent, free trade is being elevated above human rights. And this is a really big concern for user right organizations such as EFF. There should be a standalone international agreement on privacy, and though we are very far away from it, an absence of such a global legal framework for privacy is creating a push for including privacy protections through, or exploring privacy protections through trade agreements. So free flow of data nowadays must include some personal data, and trade rules from this view can encourage adoption of privacy best practices while also allowing data flows. And data flows and privacy rules have existed side by side, but how this will be taken forward in these trade negotiations is something that we need to be aware of. So I think I've done a little bit of landscaping of some of the issues. I'm sorry if I am burdening the audience here with a lot, but as you can see that the trade arena is complex because some of the negotiating parties have different agendas. It's also complex because the issues are fairly technical, but political demands may actually push for non-technical solutions. Without further ado, I would like to open the panel for discussion. I'll have Professor Pengwa, no. So,
Okay, hi. How many of you associate trade agreements with internet governance? Right? See, show hands. Okay, 1, 2. Okay, some people do. Okay, good. I think not many people do, and neither did I until quite recently, right? And it came about because I have two concerns. One is that coming from Singapore, where trade is a very big part of the economy, I was concerned about the tearing up of the TPP, right? In the Singapore economy, trade makes up 160% of GDP, meaning that the revenue and the revenue that goes through is 160%. Of course, whatever's left, of course, is just part of the GDP, right? The so-called the value added, but it's a big part of the Singapore economy. So I have some, personal vested interest in trade. But one thing that is common with both the trade agreements and the IGF is that it's better to what we call to jaw than to war. It's better to talk than to fight. So if you don't talk, then you fight. I don't know, maybe it's a man thing, I don't know. Ladies, you guys don't, but we either talk or we fight, I don't know, right? So I think that the trade agreement, therefore, is a way of, in a way, keeping peace. So if you look at our world in the last, since the Second World War, right? So we've had more trade and, we've all benefited in many ways. And that, in part, has also averted the war. If you're trading, why would you go to war, the guy you're talking to, right? So I think it's important, therefore, that we have this conversation about trade. So I looked into the TPP, and I don't know if you know this, but because I was surprised that the TPP had provisions for our digital economy. Okay, so Jyoti had mentioned them, right? No custom duties on digital products, or no discriminatory taxes on digital products. Facilitate e-commerce, so the customs forms have to be in electronic form. Digital signatures have to be recognized. And the recognition of digital signatures is quite recent. If you think back, just even 20 years ago, people asking, what do you mean digital signature? You mean I scan in the document and give it to you, right? It's a digital signature. So it's quite a, relatively speaking, quite a new idea. The requirement that there should be no localization of data, right? In other words, if you are, say, Facebook, under the TPP, the countries that agreed would say that they will not demand that Facebook put its data in the country. Okay, this is the new development. Anti-spam laws, that is again new. Okay, cooperation to address cybersecurity, to address privacy, again new. So it was quite a surprise. And when I mentioned to people, I gave a presentation to some officials in Myanmar. The first question was, then why did Trump tear up the document? And of course we said, well, it's obviously crazy. We all know that, right? But was he that crazy, right? To tear up a document that actually benefits your companies, right? So what I'm putting before you, therefore, is sort of the need to have some discussion around trade agreements for the digital economy. But I think it's also interesting to think about how we might fit this discussion into the IGF, right? Because the trade agreements are discussed behind closed doors. When I think of behind closed doors, I think of, good food and, fine wine, like, hey, you want to go, red wine or white wine? I mean, a chicken or beef, right? So, okay, right? So the food must be good, right? I mean, why else will we have closed doors, right? Okay, why else? Okay, but besides the food, right? The issue of secrecy, right? So businesses are involved in a sense, businesses lobby. But what about civil society? Does civil society have a role in trade agreement negotiations? And I think if you look at the reason that the trade agreement was torn up by Trump was because there are people who were left behind. And if you followed our discussion here, you will see that in our discussions, especially from civil society groups, we are very concerned about the marginalized, people who are left behind. So I think, therefore, that the trade agreements that are being discussed could really use the input from civil society. Okay? But of course, then the question is, how do we do it? Okay, how do we get plugged into the discussions of trade at an international level, right? Inter-nation level, right? Between countries. How do we get plugged in when we are small civil society groups meeting openly, no red wine or white wine, right? Hot or cold water, right? Okay, comparison, right? How do we get plugged in there? Okay, so this is where I would certainly like to have some ideas, some discussion to think about how we might get involved. And of course, the question is, why is it important that we get involved, right? Because, so here's the scenario, right? By having trade agreements, we not just achieve prosperity, but we also achieve peace, right? Okay, ideally global peace, right? what every beauty queen is supposed to answer, right? What do you want for the world, right? Okay, world peace, all right. So we achieve that, but there is a cost, and the cost seems to be that people are left behind. So if we can get involved, maybe we can really achieve all the good stuff, right? We achieve prosperity, we achieve world peace, and we do not do it at the expense of marginalizing people, right? So some dreams, some thoughts for discussion, right? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Can I please ask Rajneesh Singh to now give us his perspective?
Okay, thank you for giving me this opportunity. So I haven't talked about trade in a very, very long time. It's from many, many moons ago when I was in a completely different life, when I was involved with the private sector. So I was involved in some trade negotiations. Nothing to do with the internet or telecoms. It was about commodities, actually, agriculture. So but here we are. So, you know, interesting. So, well, Jyoti was giving an overview of the landscape that exists. And I was sitting here, apart from trying to listen to, I was also trying to read. So that's why I was sort of sitting like this. And, you know, what struck me was that, man, just reading and hearing this is giving me a headache. So imagine how others must be feeling, right? And then it took me back many, many years when I was sitting in a trade negotiation, and I remember the same headache I had back then. You know, there's a lot of stuff you don't understand that people say. There's stuff you think you understand, but they think it means something else. And that's when we start negotiating on what we need to converge on, right? But there's some other bits and pieces to it, right? And again, based on past experiences, I won't go into what I was involved in terms of trade, but just some observations from back then, which have not really changed in today's trade negotiations either, as far as I can tell. Again, so my caveat is that I'm not currently involved in any of this sort of work, but from what I can read and hear and see, it appears to be the same. Now, when you have a bunch of countries doing multilateral negotiations, right, there's also going to be, there will always be 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 big countries, maybe a couple really big countries, and there'll be a lot of small countries involved in that discussions. The small countries have a few things they want to sell to the big countries. The big countries have that leverage over the small countries because in order for them to be a partner of that agreement, they can push through some of their thoughts, their things. So, I mean, some of the things that were outlined before. For example, the no tariff on digital products and services. Now, if those digital products and services are being made in the super big countries, which is more or less the case globally today, then there is a bit of inequality there because the smaller countries may never ever get to this stage. You know, so where do they get their revenue base from? Where does their taxation revenue come from, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots of parts to that puzzle, in my opinion, and some of those issues have remained for decades. The other bit is that, you know, again, based on my experiences on what I went through, when I went into those meetings, I was representing the business community or part of a business community delegation. That's before this multi-stakeholder model thing came into fashion, right? Of course, today we would call it semi-multi-stakeholder because it was the government and it was the business community involved in those discussions, which seems to be true today as well. But when we were going to those meetings, talking to people from the other countries, be it government people or business people, they were not thinking about civil society or users or anyone else. They were completely focused on, you know, how are we going to ensure that my rice reaches your market and your sugar can be sold in my market. I mean, that was the sort of discussions we were more concerned about. So, I mean, it's not as if there was a desire to exclude people, but the feeling was that this is about rice and sugar. Okay, so let's just focus on that. However, the world has changed. Particularly the digital economy, and every country aspires to be a digital economy, to be some sort of a knowledge society. And if you look at the trade that exists in digital services today, that's a large, large proportion of the world economy. So things are no longer the same. And I think what's also happened is these trade negotiations have largely been done by certain ministries or agencies within government. Although new things have come into play, you know, the multi-sector approach we have with the digital economy. I think the thinking of those, you know, how do we address those negotiations, how we go into those negotiations, that mindset hasn't changed. I can also compare that to the telecom world, which I had some linkages with as well in the past. Today, when there's a telecom-related consultation in many countries, there is some sort of public consultation. There's some sort of open dialogue. Many countries have gone towards, or regulators and policymakers have gone towards some sort of a multi-stakeholder dialogue when they want to talk about some sort of telecom policy or national ICT policy. But that didn't just happen overnight. That took many years of advocacy and influence and lobbying to some extent to get there. So I think the trade part of it is that's what's needed there. You've had other panelists say that it's a closed process. And I think to some extent, and again, so with all the caveats I had before, that is because that's how it has been done for decades, and that's all those guys know. So it's up to some others around them and maybe themselves to realize that things are changing, the dynamics are changing, so we need to expand that out. I think there is cause for that. I read recently that EFF had some sort of consultation in Hyderabad just this month maybe, where there were people from those negotiating countries who came in and sat as observers. Again, correct me if I'm wrong. So at least that's a step forward in my opinion. Okay, at least this coming, they may not say anything, they may not offer opinions, but at least they're listening to the concerns. So I think that's perhaps something we can try and push a little bit more on. Let me stop there because I'm sure others are itching to say something, and I've probably spoken too much. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajneesh. That was really helpful. And it is, in fact, transparency, of course, is a main issue. And just to fill you in about the consultation that EFF organized, so we had a really, we have a contrast of sorts. The RCEPs are, so trade negotiations go in rounds, and these rounds are held in various countries, and obviously depending on which country they're held in, the host organization will frame the process. So the 18th round was in Manila, and we organized a workshop on intellectual property and focusing on that chapter. For those of you uninitiated with RCEP, the IP chapter for RCEP has been leaked, and we wanted to discuss the specific provisions that were overlapping with TPP because we have prior experience of weighing in on these issues and how they were problematic in the TPP context. The experience in Manila was actually really, it's actually how it goes mostly. We went through the process of booking a room, of inviting negotiators, and at the last minute, it so happened that a private community event clashed with our consultation, and very few negotiators showed up. So again, we are working blind when we, as civil society organizations, are also trying to intervene in these processes. There is no official schedule that is released for us. At Hyderabad, things were a bit more interesting. Actually, all credit to Mr. Akkuputra on my right here, who, as the WGEC chair, actually ensured that the negotiators from e-commerce turned up for a negotiation, but the host country did not. And again, going through the process of inviting and with the limited resources that civil society usually has, it might not always be it might not always be possible for us to create these space for policy dialogue in the trade area. And of course, there is a need to open up these talks, and there is scope for more public consultation. I'll stop at that and ask Tip to bring in her perspective.
So, so I think, I was listening in on two other sessions this morning. One was on blockchain and the other one was on, I think, transparency on algorithms and how it plays a very important part in, at least for me, in this perspective I'm coming from is digital trade. But the aspect that I found missing from these two conversations, and also to some extent from my peers on this floor, is there is no legal and regulatory framework, a global one, that addresses these issues. And that's where I think this space has not actually had a lot of, let's just say, I don't like the word intervention, but at this point, let's say intervention from any perspectives of internet governance. And to the point of Peng Hua was saying about it's how do you relate trade to internet governance, and suddenly you found yourself in this space? It's because officially something very important happened in 2015, as we all know, which is the UN Sustainable Development Goals 2015 was voted on universally by both developed and developing countries. But what you didn't know is also a representative within the legal community. And these legal communities are people who actually draft treaties, international treaties, law, and business laws, also negotiated for a text within the 17 goals to ensure that future treaties, international laws that regulate the world's trade systems today also adhere to Sustainable Development Goals. So as to the point of what Raj was saying about, yes, it's great to have bilaterals and multilaterals and all these mega treaties, but do they serve a bigger purpose beyond commerce? And that is livelihoods, it's about empowerment, it's about technology transfer, and all the other things that matter, like climate change. So, so I was actually in a meeting with UNCITRAL for 3 weeks, looking at ways of how can the legal community work towards this aim. And there was a lot of very honest discussion around this topic, which I won't have the time to actually mention here, but I will give you an update of what are the areas that they're tackling, and maybe these are the areas that we can help them as much as possible. But coming back to the space I'm working in, which I want to actually share with you the importance of trade, not just to Singapore. 70% of the world's trade agreements, we're talking about preferential trade agreements, reside in Asia Pacific. 70%, okay? Which means to say that this region, Asia Pacific, within the definition of ASCEP, that includes Central Asia, South Asia, Far East, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific, where our economy is led by trade. And there is a decoupling effect between developed and developing countries in the end of 2014. If you go back to some of the statistics from World Bank, ADB, all the big banks, you'll see that because of this very anti-globalism sentiment and populism from the developed world, a lot of trade is happening in South-South region. The South-South region includes Asia Pacific, Africa, and Latin America, yes? So guess the percentage of trade only in Asia Pacific, out of the entire South-South, 85% belongs to Asia Pacific. So in other words, this decoupling effect means that this region has, to some degree, a political will to push a lot of the agendas on treaty agreements related to trade. That's one. Two, at the end of 2016, for the very first time, we have a regional, regional, what do we call it? Paperless trade facilitation agreement, which was facilitated by ASCEP for the Asia Pacific region. Again, the first in the world. And under all of this, and there are various other creative things happening in this region, so I just want to let you know that the space in terms of trade and legal frameworks, although hasn't caught up with the rest of the conversation on internet governance, but it's pretty open at this point. The other thing I also want to let you know is that because of this intra-regional trade that's happening in this region, there's also an increase of investor dispute cases between investor and state, meaning, and this is mainly where investing companies, and most of them are Asian companies investing in Asian companies themselves, are now having disputes with governments in Asia. So what does that mean? It basically means there are a lot more revision on looking at how all these international treaties, regional trades, need to relook at how they want to do things in the future. So how does digital trade works here, as Jyoti was saying? If you look at GATT and GATS, which is under the WTO's definition of e-commerce or digital trade, there isn't actually a real one. There isn't one. And they are looking at this. So you have WTO that's written probably almost over a decade ago. You have UNCITRAL, Rome, model law and e-commerce. That's also written some 10 years ago. So there isn't there is a broken, if I might use this word, an obsolete number of treaties and agreements out there working amongst us that is not doing sufficient work in this space. So a lot of the listed things that you're talking about, a lot of these lawyers and supreme judges are using very, very broken treaties in order to do judgment or arbitration when it relates to trade. So I think they need a lot of help. And one of the reasons I'm mentioning this is that the Sustainable Development Goal that UN is pushing for micro and small, medium-sized businesses to actually become e-commerce entrepreneurs or business owners. And you have broken treaties that don't address these issues. For instance, the definition of e-commerce is one. The others are secure transaction. The definitions are not, does not allow small and micro, medium-sized enterprises to secure loans because they don't have collateral. So even the definition of secure transaction in a digital trade world is very broken. There is no universal legal framework on digital payment system which would allow payment across, across the world. So what you have is blockchain is a beautiful invention, but it's still going to have all these legal framework that needs to figure out. So again, these layers of issues around how do you actually address legal issues and dispute resolutions between different parties, they're not actually addressed at all. Which is something that the legal community is actually waking up to this. And as for the TPP on the e-commerce chapters and various other RCEP, for instance, also looking at e-commerce chapters, I think it's a beginning, but I think there's a whole lot of issues that is not just technology. It's also legal issues, and where do you build trust? How can trust be embedded within these legal framework and regulatory framework is also another issue that we need to consider. So the other areas that are also working on is on smart contracts and how that can help enable digital trade. So I'm sorry, I might not give you a lot of answers, but I'm giving you what is a short list of things that the legal community are working on. And this is important. Why? Raj was saying about, so will trade will ever be on equal footing? Definitely not, because you have bigger players and smaller players, and how do you negotiate in a way that makes sense? So yes, the legal community will try to ensure that treaties are written in such a way that no given country at least is given a fair chance, on trade negotiation. But still, if you have a legal system where a supreme judge of a particular country or any country understands the principles of sustainability within trade treaties, adhering to internet governance and civil society's concern, what you will have is perhaps a better way to govern indirectly internet governance rather than using what we call letter of the law, but rather the spirit of the law. And I think that's one area that we need to provide a lot of education to the Supreme Court judges, because they determine how these model law will be written. Thank you.
Thank you, Tip. That was really helpful. And it's interesting that you talked about dispute settlement. So TPP had a provision where foreign companies could arbitrate and sue national governments, and it is expected that the RCEP would also include a similar provision. And for a big country like India, this is really interesting, because currently in International Arbitration Court, about 40% of the cases are against the Indian government, for example. So when you bring in these hard statistics and you isolate them, and then you see how the internet governance issues could also go in a similar way, it is really frightening, actually. But before we move on, I would now ask our main man inside to answer a few questions for us. First off, how he thinks these negotiations are developing. I understand he's not at liberty to really talk about specifics, but given his expertise in this area outside of the trade arena and his perspective of multi-stakeholder dialogue to be included on internet governance issues. It would be interesting to see if he could highlight, especially for civil society, what could be some of the avenues where we could actually intervene, what support is needed from users, and how we can, what are the steps that we can take to open up these processes? For example, how can we put some pressure on governments to actually make text publicly available? Whether there is scope for national consultations or multi-stakeholder consultations. As Mr. Singh mentioned, a lot of the internet governance debates right now are evolving from these multi-stakeholder community engagement, and to isolate that and have a different path chartered through trade agreements. So how do we see that balance developing? Over to Mr. Akkuputra.
I thought, okay. Okay, good afternoon, welcome. So you see, in the different hat I have now, so I try to catch up some of the issues. I think few points I like to lay down what this trade agreement is about. So, and in our chapter, it's totally different than a normal trade negotiation working group. So I start off, this is our 9 rounds from the 19 rounds of RCEP. And so for us it's 9, if I'm not wrong. And we start working with communities since the Auckland round, that on the, it has been 5 events already. So it's not a closed door. We really try to push for multi-stakeholder discussion. That's what I like to address from our working group. So we are 17 of us, representative country, including ASEAN Secretary. So 2 each, so then put everybody in. So from the GAC experience I have on 160 countries sitting in the same room and trying to find a consensus, and going to the RCEP in the beginning is quite challenging because the agenda is quite very big. And I have to tell that, sorry that we can keep our text inside. There are no leak from the e-commerce working group, so she was upset because the other IP working group was leaked. But I only can tell that the text that she mentioned is not that much different from what discussed in the room. And how is it related to the IGF? IGF start to discuss about this trade agreement in Chopeso, I think in Mexico, Chopeso. I still remember the room is full with people. People are sitting on the floor and standing. They listen to TPP at that time. And then we have the follow-up workshop, 2 sessions in Kuala again. So this is the first time that Asia having a trade agreement. I recall Dr. Dung Tip mentions about one paper that if you're interested in this work, how it affects the IGF, how should we plan very precisely. You go back to the study of SCAP that available online. SCAP published the paper about the regional trade agreement of Asia. We have 90 regional trade agreement, mega one or small one. And one of the interesting issues is that we normally call measure things that discuss in the trade agreement. I showed you the top 5, and then you can see how it affects the IGF community. First is use of international standards for paperless trade measure. And what does it mean? And that's how the electronic authentication, electronic signatures, e-document kick in. Then we follow the international standards. And what available on our hand is that golden ODs, PKIs, and the words of mutual recognition is there. And on the other hand, the civil society talk about blockchain, smart contracts, and so I cannot mention that how it's going to go, but that is. Second is e-certificate and e-signature, electronic signatures and electronic certificate have been 40% mentioned under this 90 RTA. Electronic exchange, law for electronic transaction. That's why we mentioned about ancestral model law. And I hope you're aware that in April this year, they published a new documents about that reflect on federation, the trusted services, how the authentication should rely on, whether it's a trust model services or claim services. So they're not that slow. They're coming out new. And technical community should read that document very clear. They empower the authentication to go for the cloud services, federations, how we have the open identity. The fourth is e-customs and e-submission of everything. So this is a top 4 or 5 that more than 40% mentioned. So it's related to you because you are in technology. Everything is based on the internet. Even the first chapter of every trade agreement, including in the chapter of transparency or Marrakesh. This morning I heard somebody mention about Marrakesh, the WTO trade facilitation agreement that reached the EIF, we call EIF, entry into force first in the world. If you are interested how it affects you, please read it. Because every country binding with that already. It's WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, the Marrakesh. So 21st of February this year, more than 120, I cannot remember the exact name, 24 I think, because new country appear every now and then rectify. So now they announced already, this is the first the global trade agreement that reached the EIF in the history of the WTO. 21st of February, it will be enforced. All of us who are sitting here on the 22nd of February next year. For example, first chapter, publication of all import-export services. Declaration process have to be published over the internet. Make it available in English. Okay, for the country using English, it's not a big issue. Imagine Thailand, it might took us 4 or 5 years down the road to make that. Otherwise, if you want, and how they enforce, how they're monitoring this mechanism. So if you ship the goods in and the customs said, no, we want this kind of document, and it's not state in the publication, so you go to the dispute. Simple as that. So this will boost up the internet usage, the way that the authentication of the server might be in place. So you try to read that, it's available online. Half of it is about digitalization of the trades. There are opportunities and there is the rooms for you to really see how it affects you as you're in this internet space. That's the second issues I like to address. That the trade facilitation agreement, the regional trade agreement, is all pushing and affect the internet. Good or bad way, I don't know. It's up to you. And I should say that it's not about talking about the text. If I not disclose the text, I cannot discuss about the detail of the text. But I'm not coming from the MA, so why sitting there is because I know the subject matter that discussed. And the topic you have been mentioned is not far from what we discussed in that room. But what I would like to tell is we don't go into detail. The chapter of e-commerce is different than trade in services, in goods and services, because they bargain about the tariff, what it includes, and market access and all that stuff. E-commerce, we try to foster the e-commerce because there are different gaps between LDC, least development country, especially in RCEP, and the country that already developed. For example, ancestral model law is in 1996, even though they have the second revisions in the 2000 something, right? But then not every country is comply with this ancestral model law, including Thailand. Because you cannot catch up with what ancestral mentioned. Then the chapter of provision related to ancestral state there, that every country have to try to catch up with what ancestral mentioned. And that will help the community. Like for spam, why we need to mention, because the mechanism is different from one country to another. Some countries have the Spam Act, some countries don't. So how the world reach the interoperabilities when you have the problem? Because everybody knows that spam is a fundamental of cybersecurity threat, because they start and then it's go to phishing, botnets, and so what spam is talking about is normally what are the mechanisms required to stop the spam. It's known factor. So we get this issue from the communities. Minimum government might try to minimize it, or it have to be opt-in, opt-out. This is very basic thing. Try to have the same level of measure, so then that will foster the technology provider. And we don't go into detail of that create the discrimination among countries. And that is all about inside the e-commerce chapters. But it's of interest of every country. Our work group is always the groups that people ask that what you coming out, because e-commerce become cross-cutting issue. I have to run almost like in ICANN, we call cross-constituency between working groups. So I have a nightmare. She tried to catch up with me running around several meeting rooms. Imagine 580 of us sitting in different working groups, and then we don't have wine, in fact, in the room, so we just having a water and coffees, and then it's as tough as in ICANN GAC rooms, but I have to work with IP groups, I have to work with the service, trading service and product. And one other thing I like to mention, this is interesting, I did not discuss about the text, and I would like to share the views to the community. When we talk about, we don't charge at the custom duties on the electronic transmission, it look nice for digital products. What happens if you transmit the electronic data and it transforms to be a goods? Because it happened with the 3D printing technology, medical supply, construction materials. You buy nuts and bolts for your toilet, kitchen, it's all made from plastic that you can use the 3D. In the old time, you have to manufacturing, put in a box, put the barcodes, and now the world, you can order it. Either you go to the outlet that they have, and then the electronic transmission transform to be a goods. So you have to see the world we live is changing now. So WTO moratorium that will be discussed this year, I think it's this year, right? Yeah, we have a tough time discuss on this issue, especially in the medical area, because all the component of human being is very expensive. These are the example that the changing world and the things that we discuss in the room, we try to outreach to understand that what will help to foster and balance between countries, eliminate the difference, and we are different and the other, lucky us, because there are no thing to exchange, no cake, nothing to exchange among us. It's only the role of the government, how could we create the environment that will be foster the e-commerce development. Lucky me to work in these groups, working groups, and then this year it's all publicly known, we try to close the RCEP. But it's a community that need to see that how could you benefit from this trade agreements. And I don't think about whether you fight or not. But one last thing I like to mention is that these are the problem of the communities, that you have to look into every aspect of the story. In Nairobi 14, happened 2 years ago, UNCTAD announced e-trade for all initiative. So will there be an e-commerce I heard that Jack Ma have been making interview, and he said e-commerce will never exist. It's a die, okay? I used to speak to Steve Crocker, who invented the internet, and he said, he have an interview here in Thailand, and people ask about what will be the future of internet. He said there'll be no more internet. And what he shared is that we born at that time, I'm born, maybe you're not. When the kids, when you go to the department store, there is like blender that are electrical, the iron that are electrical. Because at that time, there is a changing between manual and electric. What Steve means is that the device used to have to specify whether it's connected to internet or not. But now everybody can assume that it will connect to the internet. The commerce is not the term that we're going to use anymore. E-commerce. We don't differentiate between the manual commerce and e-commerce. But the deep meaning of that, you have to look, e-commerce is a mess. No standardization, return policy, you name it. It's a mess. It's a Mickey Mouse, and it's like Alice in Wonderland if you talk about e-commerce. All the big players have their own rule set. Think about the trade. Everybody know Incoterm, shipment, return, merchandise, how the claim process of the insurance done. It's up in 100 years. So that's how e-trade for all will cover the e-commerce. And that's why I can name it publicly. Jack Ma become an advisor to the UNCTAD. There are a lot of talk in the UNSCAP. So the market is shift from working as, you can see that, to foster the SME, whether the mechanism will achieve to trade gateway, or how we standardize that the SME have a chance to access the international market without the gateway. It's challenging. Please do read Electronic World Trade Platform that launched in where? Do you know? Anybody know where Electronic World Trade Platform will launch? Malaysia. Jack Ma by Alibaba Groups. What they handling mainly? Payment, digital freestone, fulfillment. The key point is fulfillment. If you want to ship your cactus tree that you grow at home and you sell on the eBay, you need a lot of document to support that little tree. Whether it's taking from the wild, you need to take a CITES document, whether it's free of disease or we call SPS certificates. And what he established is e-fulfillment. That will help, it looks nice, it helps the SME. And that I want you to have a look that there is a player that getting into the space. And the defragmented of the technology that we're going to face, we very much tie in with the business provision that he created. It's not the technical perspective anymore. It's not a basic email that you have a choice to use. Think about that how the trade agreement go all the way to create the defragmented, because it go up to the application level. It's not only a basic service anymore. What are the difference between Google's and the others? So it's just a basic service, sending emails, sending messaging. But when it comes to the business perspective, dealing with the SME, that will be a deep defragmented that I do see. And I still challenge that whether that is the direction to go. That need the civil society community to think. And bear in mind that the trade agreement, but why they have e-commerce chapters. We also discussed about that in the room, that should it be the e-trade? Or should it be something else? And that I like to bring to you that we hardly need the community to work. We open up. She can prove that I try every possible way to Next round, and might be a last round, will be in Korea. And there's some approach from the other NGO to discuss to us about the location of computing facility and the other thing already. So I could answer some of the issue that the floor might have. I cannot review all the text because it's prohibited that I cannot disclose the text, but some of the technical terms that of your interest, how it affect you or how it affect IGF in general, whether it's create the discriminatories that we try to talk about the gender or try to talk about several things, whether this trade agreement will affect you or not. I think I'm ready to answer.
So one question that I have actually is about how competition is being probably approached in these trade agreements. Not specific to RCEP or the text, but generally from your understanding, how this competition is playing out in this arena.
I think in e-commerce we don't have that discussion that much because theoretically there's still no discrimination in internet. And it's also still one of the challenging we face is that what is mean territory? What is mean parties? Because we don't know, especially the case of Thailand. We only have 70,000.th. And if we think internet jurisdiction is there, so 75% of the corporate is registered outside Thailand. So how this thing works, how the enforcement will be done, it is still blur. And that is the internet bring to us. How could we prove that a transaction conduct in our jurisdiction? How we prove in a court that if we say that, okay, we bought this on the .com, and then how could we prove? Because the server side is not resides in our country as well, right? So there are a lot of challenging there that I think that's why the context of competition is still very blurred. That what does it mean? And we use the domain experience I have help to how could I say, clearly find to not include some of the subject that technically it cannot be solved, I should say.
So speaking of subjects that probably should not be included, for example, issues like domain names, we know that business and private interests are involved in some of these discussions. For example, at the Hyderabad meeting, the business community in India did organize a series of interventions and get together with the negotiators. How is there a scope to involve organizations such as IETF and ISOC that work in the domain name space into and include them more in these trade negotiations, or do you see the agreement has reached a point where such interventions is probably, it's a bit too late for such interventions now?
Yeah, I think it's quite late in the process until we see what will be the advice from the TNC, the Trade Negotiation Committees, that whether we extend the negotiation. Currently, we try to freeze all the texts that we already have in hand. And this issue that we still do not have the real stakeholder that coming in to discuss, so then we did not have a chance to discuss that.
Right, thank you. That was really helpful. Tip, did you have something to add on to?
So just two points, I guess, pertaining to Khun Wanawit's points. Yes, there is issues on jurisdiction. There isn't one that's clearly demarcated in terms of what legal frameworks could. But on the other side of it is also the issues of enforcement, which you've raised. And so here is where I think the UNCITRAL group, I'm not saying that they are the solution, but I think they do realize that these issues, although they are not very clear on all the issues, after all, they're all judges and lawyers, but they do understand that there is a need to actually bring in other stakeholders into this space when they write this model law, which would also include some of the points that Penghua, you were saying about some of the better provisions in TPP that could be used as an example of what would a sustainable and inclusive and a balanced and fair treaty look like. And that's one area that can help, because when there are disputes or arbitration, sometimes the model law is always given as a referral, and therefore that it can be what we call, I wouldn't call it a gold standard, but at least it is a best practice in which governments and arbitrators can look at to give a more balanced and a fairer judgment on some of these concerns. But the bigger picture here, I think, is also, okay, we're looking at the technology, we're looking at e-commerce, all these are great stuff. But we also need to understand that the competition aspect of it, which is something that is clearly not written anywhere in any treaty, but it's actually an agenda of different countries when they come together in a room to negotiate for trade. So having some sort of a sustainable treaty framework will help to some extent, I hope, provide that balance. But competition is very complex. I think yesterday I joined a group on IPR and business competition in industry, and how the industry is moving, how the technology is moving, and it's also broken. So competition also needs to be put somewhere within the legal framework itself, within the treaty framework, within the international laws that govern them. And that, again, is still very new. Unfortunately, more advanced countries tend to have the more sophisticated lawyers who can actually speak the language and write the right treaty versus developing countries that don't really have much sophistication to understand those words as well. So here's where the capacity building, at least I'm not doing a marketing pitch for my organization, but that's one of the roles that my organization that I represent, ITD, is doing, is to provide policymakers, governments in Asia Pacific, the right tools to understand how this works. How do you negotiate them? How do you go into a room, and how do you look at these clauses and how you interpret them? And this is the only assistance, at least at this point, that I see is happening. UNCTAD, which talks about e-trade for all, is very development focused. There isn't, the other aspect of it, the more complicated aspect is not covered. I don't believe UNSCAP is pushing for paperless trade because it's part of part of all of our free trade agreements, but also because they want to push for single window in Asia Pacific. So it actually works towards single window, which of course works towards the new trade facilitation agreement. I also wanted to mention, because UNCTAD told me this, that not all countries in the world are WTO members, but those who are WTO members must exceed within the new trade facilitation agreement, within the deadline and within the conditions which are given categories A, B, or C. And those who fail will be disbarred. In other words, you no longer become a member. So it's very clear cut. What it's trying to signal to all the countries, especially in developing countries, because this is to the advantage of developing countries, is that this is requiring developed countries to assist developing countries by giving them market access. If you comply within these particular requirements, I think there are 12 provisions within them. And they all work towards Asia Pacific having a more open trade and intra-regional activities. So I'll leave it at that. So business competition is still a new area that needs to be incorporated within the treaty agreements.
Right. Any questions from the audience? Yes.
Hello. Thank you for the insightful sharing. I have one question for the panel. I'm curious about, does the digital economy change the the trade law? What I mean is, for example, Google is a network, and people join a network and have sort of benefit from that. But Google is also a monopoly. But I know, my limited knowledge, tell me that if in the free trade, monopoly will have sort of punishment. So I was just curious about, does the digital economy change the free trade law? Thank you.
No, in short, for me, you have to differentiate between, we talk about duties, and some countries do not understand even. Duty is custom. local tax is local tax. It's up to you how you're going to imply your tax. That is it. There are no international local tax, except on the other hand, we have international tax holiday, kind of. The place that you don't need to pay tax. But there are no harmonization of how the local tax should be implied. So some countries require registration of the local entity, and then they try to charge tax. But I'm not touching on that because it's sovereign state that have their own taxation scheme, how they like to implement, whether you use withholding scheme or using the GST value added, it's up to them. It's a sovereign of the country, how they impose the tax. And we don't have that in the trade agreement.
Any further questions? Or Professor
Yeah,
Pengwa, would you like to make a comment?
Okay, I would say that generally speaking, and not particular to the digital economy affecting law, the general pattern is that the offline rules would apply online, but then there will come a time where you need to adapt. So if you look at, say, even in this case, e-commerce, you have this notion of intermediary liability immunity, meaning that you are immune if you take certain actions as an intermediary. This is quite a novel idea. It doesn't exist in the offline world. If you are intermediary in offline world, you are responsible. You put up a bulletin board, someone posts something illegal on it, you are liable for that. But online, the best practice is to immunize such a person, because the post could be in the thousands or millions even. So you need to immunize them if they act reasonably, typically upon notice. So the short answer is that the offline rules apply online, but sometimes there's a need to amend the rules accordingly. Yeah.
Thanks,
I have a question for Dr. Wanawit. I don't know if you can let us know how might civil society contribute at this stage to the either RCEP or the revived down the road TPP.
I just say that part of the problem we have with working with private sector or civil in e-commerce. It's different than the IP. You normally have this kind of people dealing with the pharmacy and drugs, and they're specialists on that, or e-commerce is like all over the place. And that are the problem we have. That's why we try to facilitate with any NGO that coming in, like who can say that Electronic Frontier Foundation have something to do with e-commerce, because there are no book on the ecosystem of, because it is all over the place. So I just say that feel free to send what we call non-paper to all trade negotiation, or you can address this issue with your TNC of the local. Yeah.
Raman, sorry, just 1 second. Tip wants to answer the lady's question very quickly.
I'm not sure if the question you refer to as in Google, and Google being probably the biggest player on the planet, and we're doing free trade in Asia and we're opening up all our markets, and basically it's going to be eaten up by Google. Is that what you mean? Okay, so there's a lack of a few things. One of them is harmonization within the treaties themselves. And second, there isn't any antitrust law in this region. So I think that's something that the new model law will also need to look at, how to help developing countries within this context. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
I'm Raman. I'm with the Access Now public policy team. My question is a bit on, it links a bit to the hard question I think Antanwa asked about how does civil society engage with these processes. But I'm just curious, we've now seen a succession of international trade treaties wherever they've tried, or rather proposed treaties, and that whenever they've tried to discuss technology issues on the e-commerce or I would say electronic services side, they've been controversial or they've failed, and sometimes not just because of that. So you had ACTA, mostly again on the counterfeiting side, but again talking on many of these aspects as well. Then the TPP, of course, the TPP falls into the larger anti-globalization concerns rising from now the globalized north, the developed north. And now you have thoughts about RCEP. I'm just curious that in this process of trying to engage this larger community, as you said, e-commerce is so wide, how can you engage? in many senses, it's been some of the same trade negotiators. So I'm just curious, are there any lessons drawn from the previous discussions that you're trying to channel now? One of that you mentioned was trying to engage non-profits further. But just in terms of this controversy around development of trade norms in this space, is there anything from the previous treaties that you think is useful to bring into this discussion? And the comment I'd probably add to that is just briefly on the fact that the UN is increasingly getting involved with this UNCITRAL or process through UNCTAD and elsewhere, and they have a more historic connection with, of course, the SDGs, but also the rights ecosystem. So again, taking that into the sort of multilateral trade negotiations that are happening, any lessons or useful things there? So it's a question to you, not asking about specific texts, but about like lessons and practices and the soft political norms that might be developing about negotiators. Is there any lessons drawn from the last few years, as well as the UN's increasing re-engagement with the sector? Hard questions.
Okay, I know. I should say that I've been discussed with a lot of trade negotiator. They normally call them trade negotiator, TNC. It's a career that is closed. This seems to be very first when we start to engage with the community. For them, they feel like, normally they sit behind closed door, they have a local discussion. Whether they do or not, we don't know, because when they sit in the meeting room, they said, okay, the community want this, private sector want that. It's not like, when I work in ICANN, in the GAC, normally the GNSO or the community themselves propose a paper to us. So this is all discussion dialogues, and that are the difficult, but some of the NGOs say that this is the first time they do see the multi-stakeholder kind of starting from the discussion, but it's a long way to go, I should say, for the trade.
Can I add? Well, there's also, if you think from the other aspect of enforcement, and you have all these arbitrators and also judges, I mean, their how should I put it? Their ethics is based on being neutral and being impartial. So if they get involved with, how shall I put, disproportionate level of groups, that they will also be seen as not being impartial. So how do they thread on this very delicate thing? Because I did have this very, very, very heart-to-heart talk with several of the Supreme Court judges who also believe that certain things that they're seeing is, for instance, monopoly. They don't like that, but the treaties, you can't write the treaty in a way that favors only developing countries, as an example. So I mean, I don't envy the judges and arbitrators who need to do a fair job. What sort of guideline can we provide them and help them? I think that's the role that we need to give. I don't know what it is. It has to be in spirit rather than in the letter of the law, and we need to help them.
Thank you. Any more questions from the audience? I don't think the mic's working. 1 second. Can somebody put the mic on? Thank you.
Narachai, I'm so happy and so delighted to have this wonderful opportunity to stand right here and to give some comments on the topic of e-commerce. I am not very well educated as other people in this meeting place. My highest education is just only high school, but I'm very interested in the knowledge that we are now discussing in this forum. I would like to know more about e-commerce. Everything in human life has two ways, positive and negative. We have darkness and we have the light. Okay, we have black and we have white. I would like to know more about the downsides and the upsides of e-commerce, according to your thought of Your Excellency on the platform. Thanks a lot indeed for this wonderful question.
Thank you. I think that's a good lead to closing the panel and summarizing. So, starting with Mr. Singh, what do you think are the benefits, the darkness and the lightness aspects of including e-commerce in trade agreements?
Oh, thank you, Ms. Pandey. That's a very hard question, and you've woken me up too. Look, I'd invite you, sir, to visit some of the websites of the organizations here and others to get a, if you search on the internet, you'll find lots of articles and so on about the pros and cons of e-commerce. Obviously, the great thing that it facilitates is it's far easier to use, But for that to work, there needs to be so many other things in place. And in different jurisdictions, in different markets, as Kunwanawit was saying, there's no standardization in the e-commerce space. So every big property or every small marketplace is doing their own thing. So it'd be nice to have some level of standardization so that you as the consumer, we as the consumers, know what our expectations are from the supplier, from the provider, where do we go for recourse, et cetera, et cetera. I know they're holding up the 0-minute sign, so I won't take much more time. So I'll just say that, in terms of what we've discussed here today, it's been an interesting discussion. As I said, I've come back into this space after a long time, so it was refreshing. Some things remain the same, as I said before. Some things haven't changed. The gentleman asked if we've had any learnings from the past. I would hope we have, but sometimes I feel we haven't. We keep on making the same mistakes in a lot of these negotiations. Maybe it's because the old negotiators have sort of left the field and the new ones come in and they start to reinvent the wheel, perhaps in some manner of speaking. But getting back to the actual RCEP and other things that are happening, I really think it's now high. As I said before, dynamics have changed, the world's evolved, new models of consultations and governance have come about, and I think from the trade side as well, we need to start looking at how we can improve that process, which means involving multiple other stakeholders. There are some challenges. I think Tip or someone maybe said that before. Who do you invite to those negotiations from civil society or other sectors of the community? Because that's actually a very hard question to answer. If you don't invite one, does the other get upset? And then what is your standardized manner of doing that? So there's some larger questions I think that need to be addressed, but point being, the process I think still needs to be far more open than it has been. Closed-door negotiations, they may have their own merits, but I think in today's world, it's high time we moved on from that.
Thank you. That was really helpful. Professor Pengwa?
Okay, so just 2 points. One is that because I'm the professor at university, I must see things in at least 50 shades of gray, not just black and white. And ideally, minimum 50 shades is like the minimum. I should see at least 100 shades of gray. The second point is that e-commerce is trade, and coming from Singapore, trade is a really big thing. It basically makes your life more efficient. So things are cheaper, better, more useful, last longer because of trade. We get things at the most kind of efficient price, and e-commerce helps that. So that's why e-commerce is good. There's a downside, of course. The downside is that as we are experiencing, there is this divide. So people who are left behind are really left behind because they are not as efficient. They stay as inefficient, whereas the efficient become even more efficient. So the gap grows, and that's why I think we have to try and close that gap.
Mr. Akuputra, you're next.
Yeah, I think it's very short for me. I think we should not confuse between the commerce and internet. Commerce is a dark side for me. People can be sustainable. E-commerce might not be the answer for that. Commerce is about producing things, exchange to the money or exchange in the other form. But our late king have been promoting and been recognized in United Nations as sufficient economy, SEP, which SEP, how internet giving and to achieve the SEP, that's more important, how you share the information to the farmer, how to grow things better, and they can captive, they don't need the money, they can live. How to improve their education, their health, you don't need the e-commerce in that. And I don't want to confuse between commerce. Commerce is not the answer, especially on SDG. First goal is poverty. It's not giving the answer to eliminate the poverty, but internet can, in other forms of the technology aspect, and how could it help to eliminate the poverty, and we don't want to confuse two of these. Thank you.
Dip.
No. No, I don't think so.
So we are really out of time, but Professor will talk to you after the event, if that's okay.
We have to go to the closing.
So I think I'm for e-commerce because I'm seeing so many statistics saying that it is good. But there also is a darker side to e-commerce, and that darker side of e-commerce to me is more of the platforms that, so we bring all these people online so they can hopefully do something good for themselves and for their society, but they're also working on already existing platforms that are maybe very big players who will continue to be bigger and bigger and take a bigger part of the market share. So I would like to promote that we have localized platforms that actually allow all these new innovative businesses that come online to also be native to Asia Pacific and not just have global players. Then we don't have a voice in this space. Thank you.
Thank you. So with that, I would like to call this session to an end. Thank you so much for being here. I understand it was post-lunch and it was a difficult topic, so thank you for not nodding off. We are available here for the next day for any kind of civil society engagement in the trade area that if you're looking for. My name is Jyoti Pandey. I work for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Please find me, have a word. And thank you again for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
I know the answers. I know the answers. Yeah, that's good.
Hello. Oh, sorry. So, ladies and gentlemen, now please enjoy your coffee break, and the closing ceremony will be held at the Grand Hall at 3:30. Thank you.